Okay, I'm actually really enjoying myself here. So I wanted to turn to the points that Dave was raising, Dave Benton was raising, and go over, because I think he actually did clarify really well what the key issues were in this debate. He talked about the content of the discourse, who are the content creators, and then whether or not the results are really as bad as we're suggesting. So I accept that. I want to sort of follow that down. First of all, in terms of the content of the discourse itself, Dave was explaining that the very fact that we have more discourse is going to make it better discourse. There's more information out there, and it's going to improve overall. Is that a fair characterization? Okay. So I don't really buy this necessarily. And I think if you've ever been in the Hearn room with 30 people trying to talk simultaneously, you might have a sense of why more discourse is not always a good thing. There does need to be some way of ordering what's being said. There does need to be some sort of a hierarchy. And at some point, people need to engage with each other. Now, I'm an old political theory prof, a young political theory prof, and handsome. And I can't help thinking of John Stuart Mill's writings in On Liberty in this topic, and which is often taken to be the sort of locus classicus of the idea that the more debate you have, the better it's going to be. But even in that essay, he acknowledges that very often good ideas are put forth, but they don't wind up triumphing. Now, the example he gives involves the Protestant Reformation breaking out dozens of times before it was successful. You know, the Lollards being put down, the Vaudois being put down. And, you know, obviously that's a mistaken example because the Protestant Reformation was wrong. But the general point that you could have a movement or have an idea that is correct, that's timely coming about and yet not triumphing is really important to bear in mind. You can't be Pollyannas and assume that the good guys will always win, the most rational viewpoint will find its way out. That doesn't happen, and sometimes you need structures in place that help create more productive dialogue. Second, let's move on to this question of who are the creators. And I think a lot of Dave Kennedy and my case can be fit in this area, and I think you're correct in that characterization, that we're really concerned, again, about the level of discourse of the people, the elites, and the elected officials. Now, I'm not sure exactly where this idea that the Tea Party is the big bad wolf came from. I didn't say that in my opening constructive. I know Dave has a 30-year vendetta or something with one prominent Tea Party Republican. But I would say there's lots of positive stuff that might be taking place in the Tea Party, as well as a lot of negative stuff. We're not just talking about one social movement or political movement here, whether it's the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street. And look, I was at some Occupy Wall Street events, and they did these symbols. You went to an Occupy Wall Street event? This is the level of discourse. Instead of talking, you had various symbols of agreement and disagreement. So, I think there's some really weird stuff going on within American political discourse, and it's on both sides there. I'm sorry, how much? Okay. That's great. Sorry, that's it.
Paul and David have talked a lot about structure and order in this debate that filters ideas. What I want to know is, who is this mysterious order and structure that you want controlling things? Because I think this language exactly applies into everything Dave and I have told you in this debate. That the exact problem with American political discourse that has now been changed is, you don't need any higher up, any person who's this mysterious nebulous structure to control everything. You can let average people have conversations and let their actual viewpoints be expressed in a way that it wasn't before. So I want to talk about just two things. The first is this idea of the average person, and the second is the elites in politics. I'm kind of grouping them together because I didn't really see how they're meaningfully different. So on this idea of the average person. So what have we heard from them about the average person? We've heard it's very bad because you can go on the internet and no one will be able to prejudge what you're saying because they didn't know who you were when you started speaking. Like, what they're describing here, this anonymity thing, sounds like something wonderful. It means that people who previously weren't taken seriously because of their race, because of their gender, because of their identity, or who couldn't speak their mind because of some background they had, are now being taken seriously and their voices are being heard because they don't have to worry about this structure and order filtering them out. That sounds like something wonderful. They say we don't have the Federalist Papers anymore. But the problem was the Federalist Papers were only one aspect of discourse back in the 1700s, the end of that century. You had the Sedition Act being passed the exact same time. There were lots of bad things then too. I know these guys are like harkening back to the golden days, but the reality is things weren't all great then. But today, what you have that you didn't have then was you have blogs like Marginal Revolution, the Bullock Conspiracy, 538, real serious places where serious discussions are taking place that people do choose to engage in. And the people who don't choose to engage in those things, what about those people? What about people who just go on Fox News because they're Republicans and they want to hear their own viewpoints echoed? The truth is, they were Republicans all along. The political discourse didn't make them radically Republican. It just allowed them to actually at least get more information to form the basis of those viewpoints than they previously had. The other thing that I want to talk about is anonymity. So, I find it really weird. I'm not really sure what they're opposed to. Because on the one hand, every example they've given us is Ted Cruz and the Tea Party. But they say that it's not just the Tea Party they're talking about. But I think the reality is, what they're really getting at, and the reason we keep harping on these examples is because it's really what they're talking about. The only other example of something that was radical in American political discourse was Occupy Wall Street. And you can see our point, you see that we're telling the accurate side of the story, because Occupy Wall Street died out. And it died out because it wasn't the discourse that was driving the politics, it was the politics that were driving the discourse, and the politics weren't there to support this movement anymore. There weren't enough people who truly were willing to make sacrifices for this movement to succeed in the same way we've seen with the Tea Party. And he says at one point, you know, Ted Cruz, now look, and the establishment was mad about it, and people in Texas were mad when Ted Cruz was part. Like, yes, that's the point. The establishment is mad. It's a good thing that the establishment is mad. I want to remind them that back at the turn of the 20th century, nominees for political parties were chosen by a bunch of guys, old white guys, sitting back in cigars. Probably a lot of them were, you know, I guess not too early to be Regis grads, but if Regis were around earlier, probably would have been Regis grads, sitting around smoking cigars, making decisions about who the nominees for every political party should be. Is that a better system than everyone in this room having that conversation? That's what you're voting on in this debate.
All right.
Can I ask the first question? Thanks. Who is this establishment and filter you're talking about?
I don't think there's any particular person who occupies the establishment filter, but if you, and I don't even think there should be an establishment filter. I don't care if there's an establishment filter. What I care is that people go and have reasoned, even passionate political debates with each other that aren't marked by flaming and ad hominem attacks and all the sort of horrible things you can get away with on the internet now. I mean, you say that the internet is this magical place where people are treated fairly regardless of race, gender, sexuality. So my first question to you is, have you been on the internet?
Sure, but the internet is the same place where you have economists like Paul Krugman and Kenneth Rogoff going back and forth in a public venue about what the best economic policy is for our country. You have both things there.
And have you read any of these people who bemoan the fact that as much as they try to cut through the clutter, and as much as they try to cut through people's refusal to believe things that, you know, don't fit within their preconceptions, that they're trying to give people data and people won't listen to data?
But those people were there all along. The question is just now we can hear them and see that they're there. But the fact is that people didn't suddenly become crazy and radicalized more than they were. If people weren't willing to believe the truth, they weren't willing to believe the truth 50 years ago either.
Well, so the question is then, you know, without that data, without people providing it, is there at least not some marginal benefit, right? There are people who are ignorant. There will always be people who are ignorant. There will be people who are ignorant in the future.
There are some among us right now. Friend of mine. You sir know Ben Franklin.
That is true in every conceivable way.
Let me ask a question about the way you define the terms. You define direct interest as the product of a particular time or place, right?
I'm not sure.
Oh, you did.
I don't believe it, actually. I'm very confused because you could ask me these questions in the last Crossfire. You were like, so why do you think this is true? It's like our whole case was explaining why we think the resolution is wrong.
No. But if you said that the public interest is simply a product of any time or place, then isn't it always going to be true that American political discourse will serve the public interest? Because all you're saying is that discourse results in a result that is particular to a time or place, which really isn't proving anything.
No, what we're proving is that in a free democracy like the United States, political discourse has generally served the public interest. Don't worry, there are lots of places in the world where it hasn't. What we're saying is we live in a very great country where we're fortunate enough to say that it has always been the case, that discourse has served the public interest. Yes.
I was kind of curious, just because you were talking about how it's brought all sorts of new participants into the democratic process. But all the examples you were giving were blocked by law professors and former elected officials who are pretty entitled old white guys.
Yeah, see, it's interesting, but I'm a 22-year-old college student reading the writings of a law professor very regularly. I don't think that was nearly as common 50 years ago. And the other thing is, you also see blogs, I mean, I can name a lot of other blogs, but the problem is, none of the people in this room will happen to know those, who are the most famous ones. There's lots of blogs of people who are like college students, for instance, who have very informed and thoughtful viewpoints on things like the Russian crisis in Crimea. Present company excluded.